The trembling hand of Daniel Rivers placed a yellowed document on the polished mahogany table. The silence shattered. CEO Vivian Hartwell leaned back in her leather chair, diamond earrings catching the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Her manicured fingers drummed against the armrest. Confident. Calculating. Cold. Her lawyer, Robert Chen, adjusted his $1,000 glasses and scanned the first page with the disinterest of someone who had crushed 100 cases before lunch. "This is all you have?" Vivian's voice sliced through the tension like a blade through silk. "A 20-year-old will from some small-town nobody?" Daniel's calloused hands, scarred from years of fixing broken furnaces and leaking pipes, remained steady on the table. "Read the last page," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had lost everything twice. Vivian's laugh echoed off the marble walls, sharp, dismissive, dripping with the arrogance that $50 million could buy. "I've read enough. You don't have a prayer." Her eyes glittered with victory before the battle had even begun. The last page. Daniel's gaze never wavered. Robert Chen flipped to the final page. The color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel Rivers stood in his cramped kitchen, holding an electric bill between fingers that trembled from exhaustion, not fear. His 10-year-old daughter Zoe sat at the scratched wooden table, carefully spreading peanut butter on day-old bread with the precision of a child who understood that food was precious. The morning light filtered through curtains that had seen better decades, casting long shadows across walls that needed painting but would have to wait. "Dad, can I have cereal with water instead of milk today?" Zoe's voice carried a forced cheerfulness that broke Daniel's heart into smaller pieces than he thought possible. She was already learning to protect him from their reality. The refrigerator hummed its dying song behind him, the same tune it had been playing since their old pickup truck decided to join the growing list of broken things in their lives. Daniel turned from the window, where his non-functioning truck sat like a monument to better times, its rust-streaked body catching sunlight that somehow made poverty look almost beautiful. "Why would you want that, princess?" Daniel knelt beside her chair, smoothing hair that reminded him painfully of Anna every single morning. "Dad's buying milk after work today." The lie tasted bitter, but some lies were kindness wrapped in necessary deception. Zoe's green eyes, so startlingly bright in her small face, studied him with the wisdom of a child forced to grow up too quickly. She had inherited Anna's eyes, but Daniel's stubborn streak, a combination that both thrilled and terrified him daily. "Are you tired, Dad?" she asked, reaching out to touch the dark circles under his eyes with fingers still sticky from breakfast. The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to face. Daniel pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than usual, breathing in the scent of cheap shampoo and childhood innocence that somehow still existed despite everything they had lost. 2 weeks before the confrontation that would change everything, Margaret Henderson from the church auxiliary knocked on Daniel's door with news that felt like salvation, wrapped in embarrassment. Her weathered face carried the kind of sympathy that made pride feel like a luxury he couldn't afford. "Daniel, dear, I have a job for you," she said, her Scottish accent making even Charity sound dignified. "Mrs. Hartwell up on Highland Drive needs her heating system repaired." The name meant nothing to him then, just another wealthy client in a town full of people who could afford to fix things instead of learning to live with them broken. Margaret pressed a folded paper into his palm with the address and phone number, her touch lingering like a benediction. "She specifically asked for you, son. Seemed to know your reputation." Daniel stared at the elegant handwriting, wondering how anyone in the Mansion District had heard of Dan's repair service, a business that consisted of him, his tools, and a prayer that each job would pay enough to keep the lights on another month. The Hartwell estate rose from manicured lawns like something from a different century, all Georgian columns and ivy-covered walls that whispered of old money and older secrets. Daniel's battered truck looked like an apology parked between the circular driveway's perfect hedges. The iron gates had opened automatically, which should have been his first clue that nothing about this job would be routine. Margaret, the estate's housekeeper, a different Margaret than the church lady, though both shared the same no-nonsense demeanor, led him through corridors lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge his work boots with their painted eyes. The heating system's been acting up something fierce, she explained, in a voice that suggested this was merely the latest in a long line of household inconveniences. Mistress doesn't want to replace the whole thing, mind you. Says it has character. The basement smelled of old money and older secrets, with pipes that belonged in a museum and a furnace that predated the Great Depression. Daniel was elbow-deep in ductwork when footsteps echoed down the basement stairs, each click of heels announcing someone accustomed to being obeyed. He looked up to see a woman in her early 30s descending like royalty granting an audience, her navy blazer perfectly tailored and her blonde hair caught in a style that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Everything about her screamed money and power, from her designer shoes to the way she held her shoulders like someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize anyone was working down here," she said, though her tone suggested she was rarely sorry about anything. "I'm Vivian Hartwell." The name hit Daniel like cold water, though he couldn't say why. There was something familiar about her face, something that nagged at the edges of his memory like a song he couldn't quite place. "Daniel Rivers, Dan's repair service," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades, suddenly aware of the grease under his fingernails and the patches on his work shirt. "Rivers?" Vivian repeated the name slowly, as if tasting something unexpected. "Have we met before?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Daniel studied her face, searching for the source of his recognition, but found only expensive skincare and careful makeup that suggested a woman who never let the world see her without armor. "I've lived in Millbrook my whole life," he said carefully, the same answer he gave everyone who asked that question. "Maybe you knew my grandparents. They used to own property near the lake." Something flickered in Vivian's eyes, too quick to identify, too significant to ignore. She moved closer to examine his work, her perfume mixing with the basement's mustiness in a way that felt oddly intimate. "The lake property," she murmured, almost to herself. "Near where they built the shopping complex." Daniel's hands stilled on the wrench. "That was our land. Had to sell it 15 years ago." The admission felt like pulling out a splinter. Necessary, but painful. The heating system took 3 days to repair properly, which gave Daniel 3 excuses to return to the Hartwell estate and try to solve the mystery of Vivian's familiar face. Each visit followed the same pattern, professional distance dissolving into something resembling friendship, as they talked about Millbrook's changes and stayed carefully away from personal topics that might reveal too much too quickly. Vivian had a way of asking questions that felt like genuine interest rather than polite conversation, and Daniel found himself sharing stories about Zoe's latest adventures at school and his struggles with single parenthood that he rarely discussed with anyone. On the 3rd day, Vivian appeared in the basement with 2 mugs of coffee and an invitation that surprised them both. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" she asked, the question emerging as if it had been waiting for the right moment to escape. "I mean, if you don't have other plans, if Zoe wouldn't mind eating with a stranger." The offer hung in the air like an olive branch extended across an invisible divide. Dinner at the Hartwell estate felt like stepping into a different world, one where meals were served on china that cost more than Daniel's monthly grocery budget, and conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine Vivian poured for herself, while he stuck to water. Zoe, initially overwhelmed by the mansion's grandeur, quickly warmed to Vivian's gentle questions about school and friends and dreams for the future. Daniel watched his daughter blossom under the attention of someone who seemed genuinely interested in her answers, not just making polite adult conversation with a child. "Your dad tells me you're quite the artist," Vivian said, admiring a drawing Zoe had pulled from her backpack. "This is beautiful work." The praise made Zoe glow with pride, and Daniel felt his own walls beginning to crack just a little. There was something about the way Vivian looked at his daughter, not with the careful distance of someone unused to children, but with an intensity that suggested personal investment he couldn't quite understand. The comfortable evening shattered when Daniel stopped at Miller's pharmacy to pick up Zoe's asthma medication and saw the headline that changed everything. Hartwell Industries CEO returns to hometown roots. The accompanying photograph showed Vivian in a black business suit, standing before architectural renderings of a massive commercial development planned for the exact spot where his grandparents' house once stood. The caption read, "Vivian Hartwell announces $50 million investment in Millbrook Lake Commerce Center, bringing hundreds of jobs to the region." Daniel's hands shook as he read the article, each word feeling like a small betrayal that grew larger with every sentence. The woman who had invited his daughter to dinner, who had listened to his stories with apparent sympathy, was the same person planning to profit from the land his family had been forced to sell during their darkest hour. The medication bottle slipped from his fingers, rattling across the pharmacy floor like dice announcing his luck had finally run out completely. That evening, Daniel drove to the Hartwell estate without calling ahead, his truck's engine knocking in protest as if it too understood the gravity of the situation. Margaret answered the door with surprise, but before she could speak, Vivian appeared at the top of the staircase, still wearing her business clothes from what had clearly been a long day of corporate machinations. One look at Daniel's face told her everything she needed to know. "Margaret, could you give us some privacy, please?" she requested, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The housekeeper disappeared as quickly as discretion allowed, leaving them alone in a foyer that suddenly felt more like a battlefield than a home. "You saw the newspaper?" Vivian said, descending the stairs with measured steps that suggested she had been preparing for this confrontation since the article went to print. "I can explain." But Daniel's face had already closed off, his earlier warmth replaced by the cold anger of someone who had been played for a fool by people with more money than conscience. "Hartwell." Daniel spoke the name like a curse, every syllable weighted with betrayal and disappointment. "You never thought to mention that your family bought our land when we were desperate? That you're planning to build a shopping mall where my grandparents lived for 40 years? His voice remained steady, but his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching like he was trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. Vivian moved closer, her corporate mask slipping to reveal something raw and unguarded underneath. "I wanted to tell you," she began, but Daniel cut her off with a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. "When? Before or after you pumped my daughter for information about our lives? Before or after you made us feel like we mattered to someone?" The accusation hung between them like a sword, sharp enough to cut through whatever fragile connection they had built over shared meals and careful conversations. Vivian's composure cracked, revealing vulnerability that seemed genuine, but might have been another performance in a game Daniel was only beginning to understand. "You think I planned this?" Vivian's voice rose with what sounded like genuine hurt, though Daniel was no longer sure he could trust his ability to read her emotions accurately. "You think I invited you here as some kind of elaborate scheme?" Her hands trembled as she reached for the back of a chair, needing something solid to anchor herself against the storm of accusations. "My family paid twice the market value for your grandparents' land." she continued, her corporate confidence wavering like a candle in wind. They waited 3 months for your family to find another place to live. They could have forced a quick sale, but they didn't. The defense sounded rehearsed, like something she had told herself repeatedly, to justify actions that might have kept her awake at night. Daniel stared at her, searching for truth in a face that had become beautiful and terrible at the same time. "We didn't have a choice," he replied quietly, the fight draining out of his voice. "Anna needed surgery. We needed money." The admission felt like opening an old wound that had never properly healed. The next morning brought a phone call that changed the rules of their complicated game entirely. Margaret's voice carried an urgency that made Daniel's stomach drop before she even spoke. "Mr. Rivers, Mrs. Hartwell needs to see you immediately. It's about your daughter." The line went dead before he could ask questions, leaving him staring at his phone while Zoe ate cereal with water and pretended not to notice his growing panic. The drive to the Hartwell estate felt longer than usual, every red light an eternity of worst-case scenarios playing in his mind. He found Vivian in her study, surrounded by legal documents and wearing the same clothes as the night before, suggesting she had not slept since their confrontation. Her face was pale, her usually perfect hair disheveled, and her hands shook as she gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her desk. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you from the beginning." The manila folder she pushed across the desk looked innocent enough, but Daniel's instincts screamed danger as he reached for it with hands that had suddenly forgotten how to be steady. "Adoption records," Vivian said before Daniel could open the folder, the words falling like stones into still water. "From 2015. A baby girl, born in Millbrook General Hospital on March 15th. Daniel's world tilted sideways as the date registered. Zoe's birthday. The day that had brought light back into his and Anna's lives after years of failed pregnancy attempts and broken dreams. His fingers fumbled with the folder's clasp, though part of him wanted to throw it away unopened and pretend this conversation had never happened. "I was 20 years old," Vivian continued, her voice gaining strength, as if confession was a relief she had been waiting 10 years to experience. "Fresh out of college, no job, no support system. My mother had just died, and I was completely alone." The papers inside the folder told a story Daniel wasn't prepared to read, each document a piece of a puzzle that would shatter his understanding of his own life. Birth mother, Vivian Elizabeth Hartwell. Adopting parents, Daniel and Anna Rivers. Baby's identifying marks, heart-shaped birthmark on right wrist. Daniel's vision blurred as he stared at the birthmark description, thinking of the small mark Zoe always covered with bracelets or long sleeves, embarrassed by what she called her weird spot. The folder slipped from his numb fingers, scattering papers across Vivian's pristine desk like evidence of a crime scene. "No," he whispered, the word coming out as both denial and plea. "This isn't possible." But even as he spoke, pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Zoe's green eyes that matched Vivian's exactly, the way she had responded to Vivian's attention at dinner, the intensity of Vivian's interest in a child she supposedly barely knew. "I've been looking for her for 10 years, Vivian said, tears streaming down her face without regard for makeup or dignity. "When I learned that Daniel Rivers had adopted a daughter named Zoe, I had to know if it was her. I had to see if she was happy, if she was loved, if I had made the right choice." The confession hung between them like a bridge burning at both ends, leaving them stranded on opposite sides of a truth too large to cross. "You've been watching us," Daniel said, the words feeling like accusations and revelations at the same time. The repair job was just an excuse. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, as if the physical world might slip away entirely if he didn't hold on to something solid. Vivian nodded, guilt and relief warring across her features like competing storms. For 2 years, I've known where she lived, where she went to school, what she looked like. But I never approached, never interfered. I just needed to know she was okay. The admission should have felt like violation, but instead Daniel found himself thinking of all the times he had wished for help, for someone who cared about Zoe's welfare as much as he did. The heating system really was broken. Vivian added with a weak smile that held no humor. I may be desperate, but I'm not a complete fraud. The joke fell flat in the heavy air between them, but it revealed a glimpse of the person behind the corporate facade and the biological mother's anguish. That night, Daniel sat in Zoe's room long after she had fallen asleep, studying the face that had been his whole world for 5 years and wondering how he had missed seeing Vivian's features reflected there. The heart-shaped birthmark on her wrist seemed to pulse in the dim light like a brand marking her true parentage, and Daniel found himself torn between gratitude for the woman who had given him his daughter and terror that she might want to take her back. Zoe stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about homework and art class and the nice lady with the big house who made really good pasta. Even unconscious, she was processing her world with the resilience of a child who had already learned that life could change without warning, but that love remained constant if you were lucky enough to find it. Daniel reached out to touch her hair, the same gesture he had performed thousands of times, but now it felt different, like he was memorizing something that might not belong to him much longer. The DNA test results arrived 3 days later, though Daniel already knew what they would say. 99.7% probability of maternity. The number should have felt shocking, but instead it felt like confirmation of something his heart had recognized the moment Vivian looked at Zoe with eyes that held 10 years of wondering and regret. He called Vivian from his truck outside the medical office, his hands shaking as he dialed her number. I know, she said before he could speak, her voice steady in a way that suggested she had been preparing for this moment since the day she gave birth. What happens now? The question hung between them like a challenge and an invitation, with Zoe's future balanced on whatever decision they made next. I don't know, Daniel admitted, honesty feeling like the only gift he could offer in a situation that had moved far beyond his ability to control or understand. But we need to figure it out together. The words surprised him, even as he spoke them, suggesting a partnership he wasn't sure he was ready for, but knew he couldn't avoid. They met at Millbrook Cemetery, standing before the graves of Daniel's grandparents with flowers that Vivian had brought every year for the past decade. The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. While he had been struggling to make ends meet, the woman who shared his daughter's DNA had been honoring his family's memory with annual visits and fresh bouquets. Your grandmother Rose delivered Zoe, Vivian said, her voice soft with memory and regret. She was the one who suggested private adoption instead of an agency. She said she knew a young couple who would love a baby more than life itself. The words painted a picture Daniel had never imagined, his grandmother acting as guardian angel to both a frightened young mother and the couple desperate for a child, orchestrating a connection that would span generations. She made me promise never to contact you directly, Vivian continued, kneeling to place fresh roses on Rose River's grave. She said Zoe deserved to grow up without confusion about who her real parents were. The promise had clearly cost Vivian years of wondering and wanting, but it had given Daniel and Anna the gift of raising their daughter without the shadow of biological claims hanging over their family. There's something else, Vivian said, reaching into her purse for another manila folder that looked official and ominous. Your grandmother left something for both of us in her will, something the lawyers only recently discovered. Daniel's hands trembled as he accepted the folder, though by now he was beginning to expect revelations that would reshape his understanding of his own life. The document inside was a codicil to his grandmother's will, dated just months before her death, establishing a trust fund for Zoe's education and leaving specific instructions that could only be executed if both Daniel and Vivian were present to claim it together. She knew. Daniel whispered, staring at the legal language that somehow captured his grandmother's voice from beyond the grave. She planned for this day. The trust was worth enough to secure Zoe's future education and provide Daniel with the financial stability he had been struggling to achieve through broken furnaces and leaking pipes. But it came with conditions that would bind him and Vivian together as Zoe's guardians, whether they wanted that connection or not. The confrontation in the Hartwell Industries conference room 3 weeks later was theatre as much as legal proceeding, but the document Daniel carried was no prop. The will's final page contained language that Robert Chen read aloud with growing amazement. Joint custody and shared guardianship of Zoe Rivers to be awarded to Daniel Rivers and Vivian Hartwell, contingent upon their mutual agreement to prioritize the child's welfare above all personal considerations. Rose Rivers had somehow anticipated this moment, had seen into a future where her great-granddaughter would need both her adoptive father and her biological mother to become the person she was meant to be. Your grandmother was quite the strategist, Chen observed, his earlier confidence replaced by professional admiration for legal maneuvering he hadn't seen coming. This document supersedes any previous custody arrangements and essentially requires you both to cooperate in Zoe's upbringing. The revelation should have felt like manipulation, but instead it felt like wisdom from someone who had understood love better than the lawyers trying to quantify it in legal terms. Vivian's corporate mask finally cracked completely as the implications sank in. She gave us what we both needed, she said, her voice thick with tears that had been building for 10 years. She gave me a way back to my daughter, and she gave you the security to raise her without fear. Daniel looked across the conference table at the woman who had carried his daughter for 9 months, who had made the hardest decision of her life to ensure Zoe's happiness, who had spent a decade respecting boundaries that must have felt like prison walls. The anger he had carried for weeks dissolved, replaced by something that felt like the beginning of understanding, if not quite forgiveness. "What do we tell her?" he asked, the question addressing both their immediate future and the lifetime of explanations that would follow. "We tell her the truth," Vivian replied, reaching across the expensive table to touch his hand with fingers that trembled like his own. "We tell her she was loved enough to be given the best life possible, and now she's loved enough to be given even more." The words sounded like hope wrapped in uncertainty, but they also sounded like the beginning of something that might, with patience and compromise, become a family. 6 months later, Daniel stood in his kitchen, now renovated with money from Rose Rivers Trust, watching Vivian teach Zoe to make Sunday pancakes with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. The routine had developed gradually, with Vivian's visits becoming more frequent and natural until Sunday mornings felt incomplete without her presence. Zoe had absorbed the revelation of her parentage with the adaptability of childhood, asking practical questions about genetics and family trees while seemingly unbothered by the complexity that had tied her adults in knots for months. "So I have 2 mums now?" she had asked when they finally explained everything. "Mom Anna in heaven and Mom Vivian here?" The simplicity of her acceptance had shamed them both and showed them how to navigate their new reality with grace they had thought impossible. And Dad is still Dad. The confirmation had sealed their new arrangement with the blessing of the only person whose opinion truly mattered. The Millbrook Lake Commerce Center had been quietly cancelled, replaced by Rose Rivers Memorial Park, where children played on equipment that Vivian had personally selected and Daniel had personally installed. The park opened on Zoe's 11th birthday, with a dedication ceremony that drew the entire town and made the local newspaper for reasons that had nothing to do with corporate development or family drama. "This is how it should be," Zoe announced, surveying the playground from her perch on Daniel's shoulders, while Vivian adjusted the focus on her camera. Places should be for kids, not just for money. The wisdom of children often came wrapped in innocence, but sometimes it cut straight to the heart of what adults overcomplicated with lawyers and legal documents, and fears that love was a finite resource to be hoarded rather than shared. The memorial plaque beside the playground's entrance read simply, "Rose Rivers Memorial Park, where love finds its way home." And Daniel thought his grandmother would have appreciated both the sentiment and the grammatical correctness she had always insisted upon. That evening, as they cleaned up after Zoe's birthday party in their backyard, Daniel and Vivian found themselves alone for the first time in months, without the buffer of their daughter's chatter or the distraction of legal proceedings. The silence felt different now, not awkward or charged with unresolved tension, but comfortable in the way that suggested they had found their rhythm as co-parents, if not quite as friends. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked, the question emerging from thoughts he had been processing since the day he learned the truth. "Giving her up, I mean. Knowing what you know now." Vivian considered the question while loading paper plates into a garbage bag, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. "I regret the circumstances that made it necessary," she said finally. "I regret being 20 and scared and alone, but I don't regret giving her to you and Anna." She paused, looking through the kitchen window at Zoe's bedroom, where their daughter was presumably brushing her teeth and avoiding bedtime as she did every night. She became exactly who she was supposed to become. I couldn't have given her that. The admission cost her something, but it also freed both of them from whatever guilt had been lingering in the spaces between their careful conversations. 2 years after the confrontation that had changed everything, Daniel received an envelope with no return address, containing a single photograph and a note written in Vivian's careful handwriting. The picture showed Zoe at her middle school science fair, holding a blue ribbon and grinning with the pride of someone who had just discovered she was good at something she loved. She got first place for her project on renewable energy. The note read, "Thought you should know since you were traveling for work. She's talking about becoming an environmental engineer. Rose would be proud." Daniel smiled at the update, thinking of how seamlessly Vivian had slipped into the role of backup parent during his busiest seasons, attending school events and doctor's appointments with the dedication of someone making up for lost time, but without the desperation that had marked their early interactions. The arrangement they had built together was far from traditional, but it worked because all three of them had chosen to make it work, rather than fighting against the complexity that had brought them together. The last time Daniel saw Vivian before their next major life change, she was teaching Zoe to drive in the empty parking lot behind Millbrook High School, both of them laughing as the car lurched forward in fits and starts that suggested neither instructor nor student was entirely confident in their abilities. Daniel watched from his truck, remembering Anna's prediction that Zoe would be a terrible driver because she inherited his impatience and her biological mother's perfectionism, a combination that would make parallel parking an adventure in frustration. The thought should have been painful, but instead it felt like completion of a circle that had taken years to draw properly. Anna would have loved Vivian, would have appreciated her fierce intelligence and her fierce protectiveness of the daughter they shared across time and circumstance. The three women who had shaped Zoe's life, Anna who had raised her, Vivian who had given her life, and Rose who had orchestrated their connection, formed a triangle of love that had proved stronger than any legal document or social convention. On a crisp October morning, 5 years after their first meeting, Daniel received the call he had been expecting, but dreading. Vivian was moving to Seattle for a job opportunity that would advance her career and possibly lead to marriage with someone who had never heard of Millbrook or Rose Rivers Memorial Park. The conversation felt like every difficult discussion they had navigated over the years, honest and painful, and ultimately focused on Zoe's welfare above their own comfort. "She's 15 now," Vivian said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. Old enough to understand complicated family arrangements, old enough to visit during summers and holidays if she wants to. The words sounded reasonable, but Daniel could hear the uncertainty underneath, the fear that distance might erode the connection she had fought so hard to build and maintain. "What does she think?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from Zoe's recent moodiness and her pointed questions about whether adults always had to choose between love and career advancement. Zoe's response to Vivian's announcement surprised both adults with its maturity and its generosity. "I think you should go," she said over dinner at their favorite restaurant, the same place where Vivian had first told them about the adoption records that had changed everything. "You've been taking care of me and Dad for 5 years. Maybe it's time you took care of yourself." The words came from someone who had learned that love sometimes meant letting go, that families could stretch across continents without breaking if the foundation was strong enough to support the weight of distance and time. "Besides," Zoe added with a grin that reminded Daniel of both Anna and Vivian at their most mischievous, "Seattle has great colleges. I might end up there anyway in a few years." The comment was thrown out casually, but it carried the promise of continued connection and the possibility that their unconventional family might evolve rather than dissolve as Zoe moved toward her own adult life. The going-away party they threw for Vivian felt more like a graduation than a goodbye, with half of Millbrook turning out to wish well the woman who had transformed from corporate villain to community benefactor over the course of 5 remarkable years. The park she had built in Rose River's memory had become the town's gathering place, hosting everything from farmers' markets to high school graduation parties to marriage proposals that required witnesses and applause. "You changed this place," Mayor Patterson told Vivian during his impromptu speech, gesturing toward the families picnicking on grass that had once been destined for commercial development. "You showed us that sometimes the best business decision is the one that puts people before profit." The sentiment was echoed by dozens of townspeople who had benefited from Vivian's quiet philanthropy over the years. Scholarships for college-bound students, medical bill assistance for families facing health crises, small business loans that had kept Main Street vibrant during economic downturns that had devastated neighboring communities. Daniel's own goodbye to Vivian happened privately, after the crowd had dispersed and Zoe had gone to spend the night with friends, who understood that sometimes adults needed space to say things that couldn't be said in front of children. They sat on the park bench overlooking the pond where Daniel's grandparents had once taught him to fish, watching sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson that seemed too beautiful for such a difficult moment. "Thank you," Daniel said finally, the words encompassing everything from the trust fund that had secured their future to the Sunday morning pancakes that had become family tradition to the grace with which Vivian had accepted a secondary role in their daughter's life when she could have demanded primary custody through legal channels that would have destroyed them all. "For what?" Vivian asked, though her smile suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "For giving me Anna's dream," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "For letting me be Zoe's father even after she found her mother." The words hung between them like a benediction, blessing the unusual arrangement that had somehow worked because all 3 of them had chosen love over convention and compromise over conflict. A year after Vivian's move to Seattle, Daniel found himself standing in the same conference room where their legal battle had begun. But this time he was not trembling, and the document in his hands was not a desperate gambit, but a celebration of everything they had built together. Zoe, now 16 and tall enough to look him in the eye, stood beside him wearing a dress that Vivian had sent from Seattle and a smile that could have powered the entire building. The adoption ceremony was a formality. Vivian had never legally challenged Daniel's parental rights. but it was also a symbol of the family they had chosen to become, despite biology and circumstance, and every social convention that suggested their arrangement was too complicated to sustain. "Do you, Zoe Rivers, accept Daniel Rivers as your legal father?" Judge Morrison asked, his voice warm with approval for a case that had brightened his typically grim family court calendar. "I do," Zoe replied, her voice strong and clear and certain in a way that suggested she understood exactly what she was choosing and why. "He's been my dad since I was born. This just makes it official." The simple truth of her words brought tears to eyes that had seen too many custody battles end in bitterness and broken promises. The celebration afterward took place at Rose Rivers Memorial Park, naturally, with Vivian joining them via video call from her Seattle apartment, where engagement photos on the mantel suggested she had found the happiness that had eluded her during her years in Millbrook. "I wish I could be there in person," she said, her image slightly pixelated but her smile clearly genuine. "But I think Grandma Rose would approve of this arrangement. She always said the best families were the ones people chose for themselves." Zoe held the laptop so all three of them were visible on screen, their faces close together in a way that would have seemed impossible during their first contentious meeting, but now felt as natural as breathing. "We're still family," Zoe announced to the camera with the confidence of someone who had learned that love could stretch across any distance and survive any complication if the people involved were committed to making it work. "Dad's still Dad, and you're still my birth mum, and we're all still connected by Grandma Rose's magic plan." The description made them all laugh, but it was also perfectly accurate in ways that legal documents could never capture. 5 years later, Daniel sat in the audience at Zoe's high school graduation, flanked by Vivian and her new husband, Mark, who had driven up from Seattle for the ceremony that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Zoe's valedictorian speech focused on the importance of chosen family and second chances, weaving together themes of environmental science and social justice with personal anecdotes that made half the audience cry and the other half stand up cheering. "My family taught me that love is not a finite resource," she said, her voice carrying across the auditorium with the authority of someone who had lived the truth of her words. "You don't run out of love by sharing it with more people. You create more love by opening your heart to possibilities you never imagined." The speech was both deeply personal and universally applicable, touching on themes that resonated with anyone who had ever struggled to define family in terms broader than biology or legal documents. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted long enough for Daniel to catch Vivian's eye and share a look of parental pride that transcended their complicated history. The final scene of their story played out not in a courtroom or a conference room, but in Daniel's kitchen on a Tuesday morning in late summer, with Zoe packing for her freshman year at the University of Washington, where she would study environmental engineering and live just 40 minutes from Vivian's Seattle home. The pancake tradition had evolved over the years to include Mark's contribution of perfectly crispy bacon and Daniel's famous orange juice that was actually just orange juice but somehow tasted better when he made it. "You know what's funny?" Zoe said, folding her favorite sweater, one that Vivian had knitted during her first winter in Seattle, into her suitcase with the careful precision of someone who had inherited her biological mother's organizational skills and her adoptive father's attention to detail. "I used to think our family was weird because it was so complicated, but now I think we're weird because we make it look so easy." The observation was both accurate and touching, acknowledging the years of careful negotiation and mutual respect that had created the illusion of effortlessness around arrangements that would have destroyed families with less commitment to putting Zoe's welfare above their own comfort. The last conversation between Daniel and Vivian as co-parents of a minor child took place on Zoe's 18th birthday, when legal guardianship officially ended and their daughter became fully responsible for maintaining the relationships that had shaped her entire life. "We did it," Vivian said simply, her voice carrying satisfaction and relief, and just a touch of sadness that their unique partnership was evolving into something less structured, but hopefully no less meaningful. We raised a human being who knows she's loved unconditionally by multiple people who put her happiness above their own convenience. The assessment was both proud and humble, acknowledging the challenges they had overcome without minimizing the luck and grace that had helped them navigate situations that could have ended in disaster if any of them had chosen selfishness over sacrifice. Rose would be proud, Daniel replied, thinking of the grandmother whose wisdom had guided them through every major decision and whose memorial park had become the backdrop for most of their important family moments. The tradition of visiting her grave on holidays and birthdays had become as natural as breathing, a way of including her in celebrations she could no longer attend in person, but had made possible through her long-term planning and faith in their ability to figure things out. As this story ends, Daniel Rivers stands in his kitchen on a Sunday morning, making pancakes for one, and remembering the conversation with Vivian that had started it all. Sometimes the best families are the ones that people choose for themselves. Zoe calls from Seattle every Sunday, her voice bright with stories of college life and career plans, and the boyfriend she brings home for holidays, who calls Daniel Mr. Rivers, with the respect of someone who understands that this man raised the woman he loves. Vivian sends photos from her travels with Mark, their faces sun-kissed and happy in ways that suggest she finally found the peace that had eluded her during their early years of careful co-parenting and legal negotiations. The house feels different now, quieter but not empty, peaceful rather than lonely, filled with memories of Sunday morning pancakes and birthday parties and graduation ceremonies that celebrated not just Zoe's achievements, but their success in creating something beautiful from circumstances that could have destroyed them all. The framed photo on the refrigerator shows 3 generations at Zoe's high school graduation. Daniel and Vivian flanking their daughter with Rose Rivers Memorial Park, visible in the background, all of them smiling with the satisfaction of people who had chosen love over convenience and discovered that sometimes the most complicated families are also the strongest ones.